Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Alpha Bunga Bunga. It's Thursday, the 11th of March. My name is Alex Hochuli. I'm here with Philip Cunliffe and George Horace, per usual. Today, we're talking about Scotland, a relatively small country in the North Atlantic. And I'm sure our American listeners, our North American listeners, will be very happy to be here talking about Scotland because I guess half of you identify as Scottish or German or whatever the hell you identify as. I guess you guys all love identifying as something that you're not. Like all this chat about being Italian that I see on Twitter, and I look at it and it's like, there's no Italians in there. They're all US Americans.
What's the chatter about being Italian?
I don't know. There's a kind of new joke on Twitter about like, oh, Italians act like this or whatever. And you look at them and they're all just people from New Jersey.
Yeah. People like The Sopranos.
You promised we wouldn't do accents.
they want to wear tracksuits like Sopranos characters.
Exactly.
I mean, I do. So
we all do. So you guys are in the UK, of which Scotland is a constituent part. So tell me about Scotland.
Yeah, well, so we're having this episode because it's the run-up to Scottish elections in May. And though perhaps more importantly, from the international or global point of view, overshadowing these parliamentary elections in May is perhaps the prospect of another referendum on independence. So at the moment, the Parliament is part of Britain's system of devolved government, and until recently, it looked like the Scottish Nationalist Party, the SNP, were going to sweep the board. Until recently, and now it looks, the polls suggest it's more likely to be a hung Parliament or perhaps a narrow SNP majority. And we'll get into the reasons for that a bit later on in the show. Like I said, I mean, all of this is overshadowed by the possibility of another referendum on Scottish independence. The last one was in 2015. And in that one, 55% of Scots voted to remain part of the UK. And now supporters of Scottish independence, supporters of another referendum, say that the changed circumstances of Brexit, Britain's withdrawal from the European Union, demand another referendum on independence because the SNP is strongly pro-European. Scotland as a nation voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. And thus, they feel that this motivates and necessitates another referendum. And that if the SNP wins the elections in May, then this will be effectively a mandate for another referendum. So that's the issue on the table for this evening. We're going to have some guests on as well.
And I guess we should be clear that a hung parliament is not a well-endowed parliament, but it's one in which it's divided, in which no one has an overall majority, just to clear that up. Should we call up our list?
Thank you for clearing that up for us. Hey, so hi guys, great to have you on the show. I suppose before we get stuck in to talking about the issues today, which is the upcoming Scottish elections and the prospects for Scottish independence, I thought it should be useful, in the interest of full disclosure, that if that we have different views on the question and that we put our cards on the table. So I don't know, how do you, George and I, for instance, are unionists when it comes to the island of Britain. At least I think I'm correct in talking for George as well, which is to say we support maintaining the Union of England, Wales and Scotland, though we believe Ireland should be reunified. Though needless to say, however, whether or not the Scottish people want to continue with the Union is up to them, as it is a basic matter of self-determination. Speaking for myself, I'd prefer if Scotland chose to remain in the Union, but as I said, recognise that ultimately that's up to the Scottish voters themselves. What about you, Alex? Where do you stand on it?
I mean, on this podcast, of course, we like to be generous and give the colonised a voice, not trample on marginalised voices. So we're inviting the Scots on. I'm fine with Scottish independence. I don't really have any firm opinion on it. If the Scots want to leave, then that's fine. I have a slight distaste for the union, but that's more just an aesthetic thing than necessarily a political stance. So I'm actually willing to be convinced and went over to the Scottish independent side.
What's the nature of your aesthetic disagreement with the union?
Just terrible flag,
bad flag,
Queen, national anthem, the worst one I think in the whole world. I mean, just for starters. So that should be enough.
These are legitimate criticisms. I have to grant you each one of those. Okay, so Kat and David, you guys are Eurosceptic Scottish socialists, and Euroscepticism is rare on the European left as a whole, and perhaps even more rare among supporters of Scottish independence. So could you tell us a bit about why you oppose the European Union?
This is David Jamieson's favourite topic in the whole world after George Galloway. I'll let David go first.
I always struggle to answer this question of, why you oppose the EU. It's a wee bit like, why wouldn't you want to step in dog shit? I can't think of arguments for the European Union. I suppose fundamentally the reason why I was an outspoken Leave voter in 2016, to me it was kind of automatic because it's on the basis of democratic principle. The European Union is anti-democratic. It's not just undemocratic, it's obviously undemocratic, but it also directly militates against democracy when it's constituted at a nation state level. It's obviously anti-working class. We could move through an enormous litany of crimes in the last 10 years, but it's anti-working class in a fundamental sense, which is that unlike other forms of democracy or political regime, however limited in their democratic content, the working class had no role in setting up the European Union. It's entirely a project of Europe's elite, ruling elites. And, their project over the last 50, 60 years of hollowing out democratic traditions and democratic structures and moving democratic decision-making to a level where there's only elites in the room. Basically. So for me, it was automatic and not a difficult question. The 2016 question was easy, and the Scottish question is just as easy in that regard.
So go on, Kat.
For me, I've always been critical of the EU on the grounds that David says, undemocratic, neoliberal. And despite the protestations of some of my more liberal friends, it's racist. It racializes the question of immigration. As David said, when people vote against the EU usually tells them to vote again and get it right this time or else. But I also had a first-hand experience of what the EU's economic packages do. I went to Greece about 3 years before Syriza were elected. I saw firsthand how that changed over time, the actual material reality of the EU's austerity packages, what that looked like. And it looked like whole families living on the street trying to sell their fridge freezers and tumble dryers. That's the picture. It was tragic. So I knew that I would never vote in any way that could be seen as an endorsement of the EU. So when 2016 came along, I knew I was never going to vote Remain. But if I'm being honest, I really hated the Leave campaign. First of all, there was pretty much no mobilisation for Leave in Scotland. I was handed maybe 2 or 3 leaflets, tops. Nobody came to my door to ask about it. Nobody was canvassing. I didn't see the big infamous red bus of lies. The people I did come across might just have been eccentrics, but the only campaigner I spoke to on the street was a guy giving out Leave leaflets who harangued me for 20 minutes about the threat of sub-Saharan Africans. Whilst I was saying, no, wait, I have criticism of the European Union too. So he was a bit mad. So when it came down to it, I actually ended up abstaining, which was triumph of weak emotional nerve over what I thought intellectually. I was repulsed by the anti-immigrant politics, but I couldn't see any socialist case for staying in the EU, being in the EU. I wish I'd had the courage of my intellectual convictions, to be honest. But I think that abstaining or even voting to remain is one thing. I know loads of people in Scotland that voted to remain who are very critical of the European Union, but see it as a buffer against Westminster. I think that that's all one thing, and that I can set that to one side. But I think it's another, the way that the broad left across Britain then went about trying to cancel the democratic result for years afterwards. They fell into the trap of doing what the EU do to people. Vote again, you were duped, to get it right next time. And that was a really sickening thing to watch in the years after 2016.
So both of you then are part of the significant minority of Scots who were opposed to the European Union, though the majority of Scots voted to remain in the EU, in contrast to Wales and England, both of whom voted to leave as nations. So just, it was interesting what you were saying, Kat, about kind of meeting this eccentric leaver on the streets. Could you tell us a little bit about the political breakdown of pro-Brexit Scots? Who were they? Where did they come from in Scotland? who are they? Who are these people?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can tell you exactly that like none of our politicians, apart from maybe one outlier that I can think of, where
is that George Galloway?
Is
George ours? Hold on, let's be careful around that. Oh, God bless him. Apart from maybe like one outlier, I'm thinking of a guy called Oliver Mundell, who's the son of the former Secretary of State of Scotland, right? But maybe him. There was a few former politicians, people like Jim Sellers, who was quite notable in his opposition because he had made a name for himself as the architect of the SNP's independence in Europe position when he was a leading member of the SNP, and he had completely changed his mind. He was probably one of the main pro-independence politicians, but nobody sitting in the Scottish Parliament was in favour of Brexit. So, I mean, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that the Scottish anti-Brexit vote, or the Scottish Remain vote, was decisive but not totalising, right? So 38% of people in Scotland still voted to leave, right? And that's with no leadership on the Brexit case. So by contrast, every single institution in Scotland, trade unions, businesses, media, politicians, everyone is for Remain, right? There's not a single Scottish representative who is openly an anti-EU. So I think it's kind of amazing that you still have nearly 40% of people voting to leave, a third absolutely. Of SNP voters voting to leave. And I can totally understand that from outside Scotland, you might get the impression that, we're actually a Europhile nation. But that isn't quite true in the popular sense, but it is institutionally. I mean, I can't think of any institution off the top of my head, apart from Contour, obviously, that's pro-Brexit. Our website and podcast is possibly one of the only pro-Brexit outlets in the country.
Yeah, and well, no, absolutely, and so much the better for it.
I just wanted to make the point that there's clearly an element of anti-establishment working class votes that were for independence that transferred during the 2016, and it's probably more than the SNP would allow you to think.
So that was going to be my follow-up was, yeah. I mean, was there like an urban-rural divide in terms of how the Brexit vote went in Scotland? What was the class divide like on the question?
So you have that kind of the mix of traditional fishing communities. There's a chunk of discontented working class. There's some, I'm thinking of like in the borders of Scotland, kind of for quite pro-Brexit there. And it's kind of a mix of that. But like there is an element of that disenchanted, discontented, disempowered working class vote. But part of the issue in Scotland was that we had our populist moment. We had our moment where there is an expression of working class agency against the establishment, and that was against the British establishment, and probably a British establishment in a more nostalgic sense. So actually, look, an establishment that looks more like the people who are pro-Brexit in England. Yep. Like they're more like the picture of the British establishment in Scotland. So when it comes to voting in 2016, there's loads of people who think they're being anti-establishment in Scotland by voting to Remain. They think it's a punishment to Westminster because of the chronology. That would be my argument anyway.
I was actually wanting to ask that. Sorry, I just wanted to say that I wanted to ask that question myself, actually, because that was my impression of it, that the kind of, for lack of a better way to put it, the sort of populist revolt, it took the form of Brexit in England and it took the form of Scottish independence in Scotland. I think George and Phil disagreed with my take on that when I was just talking to them, when we were talking just before recording. But I mean, that seems to be that was my impression, that these things manifested in kind of almost opposite ways, but were part of a similar sort of revolt.
Yeah, well, just on that, they're both revolts in the traditional Labour heartlands. like the areas of Scotland that voted yes are traditional Labour heartlands, deindustrialised working class, people from an Irish Catholic background like myself. Like that's the core Labour base in Scotland. And that's where the revolt happened, the same way as it did arguably in 2016 in England with Brexit.
Yeah. So
to comment, a bit on that, on that class makeup. So, I mean, you need to be careful with Scotland because obviously since 62% of people voted Remain, the working class composition of the Remain vote was much higher than it was in England. But still, what we know anecdotally, and we don't have a lot of detailed knowledge about who that 38% are because nobody cares. They were forgotten about straight away, right? But anecdotally, we do know from vote counters, for example, the East End of Glasgow, that the Leave vote was higher there, just as was the Yes vote. In fact, this is an important point to bear in mind, the Yes Leave vote and the no Leave vote were at the same proportion. So by at least one poll, 38% of yes voters were also Leave voters. So it corresponded directly to the national average. And as Kat said, there's a poll that shows a third of SNP voters also voted to Leave. I mean, partly because the SNP has... it's not always been this Europhile party, and because it mobilises a popular base, a populist base and a working class base, as well as, you know, those kind of more technocratic, liberal sort of middle class voters.
Yeah. No, I mean, I thought the 30% of SNP voters who voted for Brexit, it was a fascinating kind of group, and it would be interesting to know more about them. But let's move on to talk about the SNP, because so both of you guys support Scottish independence, as indeed does the SNP, Scotland's ruling party at the moment. Before we talk about your views on independence, though, could you give us a brief overview for our listeners all over the world about kind of who are the different groups and factions who support independence in Scotland today? Like, who are the different types of people who are pro-independence?
Okay, I think there's two broad class factions, maybe not class factions, two broad tendencies in the independence movement, very broadly, that make up even the mainstream of the nationalist movement. And I think this is what is typically obscure from people observing from outside of Scotland, where Nicola Sturgeon is the image, and before her Alex Salmond were the image of Scottish independence. Scotland is almost unique, perhaps unique in the Western world for uniting its kind of middle-class, liberal, technocratic element with a more working class or kind of, you know, plebeian, lower middle class, working class, populist element. So both of those elements basically combine in the independence movement. And if we get to talking about the infighting in the SNP, that's partly an expression of that really strange coalition of forces. Outside of that, you know, there's the traditional national movement, nationalist party and kind of nationalist movement, which contains a mad flurry of different ideological tendencies, some very liberal and kind of Europhile and uncritical, some that hark back to a more kind of social democratic mood, former Labour people. I mean, a lot of the ranks of the decisive generation of the SNP were former Labour. You know, there's also the Scottish Green Party, who again kind of mix together sort of liberal traditions and so on. There's a wider kind of diaspora of maybe more radical left-wing positions and so forth. So there's a real jumble in there of populist, social democratic, liberal, all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
I mean, I sort of see it like, this is where I really expose myself as like not being an academic, or like I've never done sociology, right? But like, so I have cartoons in my head about like what these different people represent. Yeah, so I've got my anti-establishment, dissident working class people, right? Who are like in those Labour heartlands, and they hate Westminster. Like that's their bag. They're disenchanted, disenfranchised, and want Britain to break, right? That's them. You've got your kind of like aspirational PMC, grant funded, soft liberals for independence, very much in the young SNP and the Green Party. Then you've got your classic tartan Tories, which do exist. So the people who maybe own a small business somewhere in Perth, maybe like a delicatessen in Perth or something like that. They're really they're a special type of kind of petty bourgeois nationalist. And then you've got what I like to call the panicked professionals. Now, the panicked professionals are the middle class who hate change and want the status quo, right? And they are a very new group to the pro-independence fund. Yeah. And what is motivating them has been Brexit, because they don't want Brexit. They want the status quo. They want stable house prices. That's what they want. So I think since 2016, we've seen little creeps in the polls on independence. I don't know if you've noticed this, but there have been polls after poll after poll, which is saying, oh, support's going up, support's going up. It's like, it's because of Brexit. And it's true. And this is part of the problem, is that actually what the SNP have done in power since 2016 is pander to the panicked professionals. They've panicked to that section of they've pandered to that section of panicked Scottish society, saying, don't worry, independence will be a smooth process. In that, there's a really deranged interview between Andrew Neil and Andrew Wilson on the Spectator website. I don't know if you've
just tell us who they are so our listeners are all on the same page.
So Andrew Neil is the editor of the Spectator, and Andrew Wilson is a former MSP, and he works for Charlotte Street Partners, Scotland's premier lobbying firm, but he's also one of the architects of the Growth Commission, which is the SNP's main plan for independence. In this interview, he talks about independence being an orderly process, and that's a slogan for those kind of middle class, professional, panicked people in Scotland who don't want change. They don't want Brexit to disrupt, and they think independence can be a smooth process. And that's in massive contradiction to that working class base. There's a quote which remains unattributed to a SNP politician. I wouldn't attribute it in public because I can't corroborate it, who said, in 2014, we won the schemes. Now we have to win the boardrooms. And that really tells you about what the SNP have been doing in government since 2016.
So that idea of an orderly process, that's classic panic professional speak. You can see how that would appeal. And I think those I wouldn't say marketing categories, because that sounds derogatory, but those kind of portraits are really useful. But one group that I didn't hear about there was I guess you guys, is this an unfair description, a kind of national socialists? Are you guys part of this Strasserite red-brown conspiracy that we've all been hearing about?
That's great. That's great. I keep that in, right? Because because I do occasionally get called a Strasserite, so I need to feed that to my real fans.
It's funny that we don't have to explain probably to listeners of this podcast what Strasserite means, but something like hung parliament we do. Whereas you would think that those two terms, one would be more familiar than the other. But
and if you don't know what Strasserite is, consider yourself lucky. There's no need to know what that means.
Don't find out.
It's not a thing.
David,
the Red Brown Alliance. Welcome to the Red Brown Alliance.
I suppose that. So I think it was actually after the Leave vote, I ended up touring about Scotland, doing meetings, trying to meet the Leave voters, the Yes Leave voters, and I made this argument over and over again that no one was talking to these people, that was a foolish thing to do because it meant that we were losing some of our most vital parts of support. And I went to some meetings where some of the more kind of mainstream nationalists would actually, red in the face, get up and shout at you, because you remember what it was like immediately after the vote. You're a baby killer. People were saying things that were irrational, completely irrational. Yeah. And the sad thing to me was I would have people, and they were often the ones that I spoke to, and maybe these are some of the more kind of politically articulate voters. They were usually people who were in the kind of old Labour, turned SNP. They would be a bit older, maybe in the kind of Tony Benn sort of school, right? And they would walk up to me, having said nothing in the meeting, after the meetings, and say, We agree with everything you just said. Why is everyone saying that we're racists? Which to me was kind of heartbreaking, that it was older people as well saying it was sort of heartbreaking. So where do we fit in? I mean, I suppose we're trying to articulate an argument which to me is going to become completely essential. I mean, a few weeks ago, I just said, and maybe it's a long shot, but I said, I think we're going to win the argument about the European Union in Scotland for reasons we can maybe get onto, which is a bold statement, because if you look at the polls, support for the European Union, of course, remains incredibly high. But we're trying to push the argument, and I believe we'll have some success on it, on the merits, the intellectual merits of the case, that apart from anything else, the demand for membership of the European Union will seriously undermine the case for Scottish independence, seriously undermine the case for Scottish independence. And the more people understand that, the more purchase we're going to have. Because I agree with what Kat said in terms of Scots are not instinctually liberal. They're not instinctually Europhiles. The national movement is not instinctively a Europhile movement. I mean, when Kat said, Jim Sillis had to make it the case for this independence in Europe case, it was done very opportunistically. It was in the 80s, the European Union, the modern EU, was developing, and they said, look, we can get around this argument, or you're leaving this economic union, to say, yeah, we're leaving one union and we're joining another bigger economic union, which was always a slightly dishonest argument, because the UK Scotland does most of its trade with the UK and would under any circumstances. But the point is that before that, Euroscepticism was not at all uncommon in the nationalist movement, and in the SNP even. So people do sway around on this issue. And fundamentally, the European question is not the main national question in Scotland. This is the other thing. I don't know that there's ever really much more than room for one national question. In 2016, Scots who voted Remain did so because they were voting against the democratic deficit. So there's an obvious contradiction there. Yeah. A future vote on Scotland's membership of the European Union will not be the same at all. It won't have that same conflict arranged in the same way.
So could you just break it down for us? Why is EU membership incompatible with national independence for Scotland?
So it's if the SNP's case for independence at this point is a complete dog's dinner, and it's fascinating that the kind of contradictions that have emerged, because what the SNP leadership, and you have to distinguish the two things, because the SNP is led by a very secretive, centralised faction, and they don't often agree with what the conference floor of an SNP conference agrees with. It's a very undemocratic and elitist organisation in its structure. But what the SNP leadership want to do is send our monetary sovereignty to London, because they want us to be part of sterlingisation, which means we would continue to use the pound, but without any access to monetary policy. We wouldn't have a central bank. You need a central bank to join the European Union. The Growth Commission that Kat mentioned places 6 tests on setting up an independent currency. Those tests are actually mutually contradictory. You can't meet them all. And they're designed to stop Scotland achieving an independent currency, and therefore an independent central bank. You must have those things on the Maastricht to join the European Union. And then, of course, on top of that, they want to send off a foreign policy to Washington. They want Scotland to be a fully signed up member of NATO. So they want to basically exile Scotland's sovereign democratic rights variously to London, Brussels, Berlin, Washington. So they're a nationalist movement which is hostile, utterly hostile to democratic sovereignty and to national democracy at the national level, completely hostile. And that's obviously a huge contradiction, and it is causing them endless problems and will continue to do so. But it's the arch contradiction of, you have a national movement that has come into hegemony and prominence because of the voids, Peter Mayer's voids. The traditional democratic structures and traditions have collapsed. They've moved into that void, but they just want to reproduce the void.
I I suppose it's a hard question because I suppose it's so fundamental. But how do you guys see the value then of sovereignty and national self-determination, both I suppose specifically for Scotland, but also as a general principle?
I mean, I do feel like I'm at a slight advantage on some of the questions of sovereignty and self-determination. Like, I've never necessarily identified myself as Scottish. I've never felt particularly Scottish. And that is partly because I come from an Irish background. So there's never been any question for me that socialism means sovereignty and self-determination. Having an Irish heritage in Scotland means that you have kind of immediate access to a national popular tradition in the form of rebel songs, family events and that sort of thing. So I've never really been tempted by that fashionable tendency on the left to just dismiss the questions as irrelevant. It's quite a complicated relationship that I have to Scottish identity. On the Scottish left, I think there's always been a bit of discomfort about our own national traditions because, unlike the Irish, we're not an oppressed people historically. Yeah. So there's no neat moral narrative there. But I think it's important to remember that internationalism implies that there is a national level and that sovereignty isn't an absolute concept, but something that's contested between different social forces. I mean, I think that, like, for me, that's kind of how I would understand it. I mean, the task, I think, for the left in Scotland is to try and separate, like, the good elements of popular sovereignty in our historic movements, like the Red Clydeside, the UCS, the poll tax revolt, separate that from Scotland's legacy of pretty bog standard Labour Party service delivery type politics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
go on. Sorry.
I mean, I think so. The Scottish national question, which we have to remember, and I think it's very often forgotten. Like, you almost hear this sometimes discussed outside of Scotland as though the Scots are a sort of bloody-minded people. That's what Thatcher said, who are always wanting independence. The demand for Scottish independence is very modern. It basically didn't exist before 2012, not as an element of mass consciousness or a mass movement. There's always been a small pro-independence strain in Scottish society, or has been since the sort of 1930s. It was tiny then. It gained a bit in the 70s and 80s, but it's really exploded from about 2012 onwards. And it is a direct response to the conditions of, call it what you will, the void, neoliberalism, the decline of social democracy. So Scottish independence is part of the stuff that is constantly discussed on this podcast. It's how the national question, as a democratic question, has come to be a response to the hollowing out of democracy, the very one-sided nature of the contemporary class war, basically. So it could never have been a question for me to ignore from a very kind of like abstract, faux Marxian standpoint, you got some people, on the left who would say, how can you go along with this nationalism and all this kind of stuff, right? Which is a sort of aloof, abstract attitude to politics, because the independence question was confronting the democratic crisis that afflicts modern capitalist society, and is addressed by a whole series of different movements, some progressive, some quite reactionary, Scottish independence is very, very much a piece with everything that's going on, like Brexit, the Yellow Vests, Catalonia, Greece, on and on and on. And it needs to be viewed in that context. And in each of these contexts, in different ways, there's a struggle over the question of the situation of democratic life at a nation state level, at which level, it is inevitably situated.
I mean, I just really wanted to try and get across just how exciting 2014 was. So when David is talking about the vote and what that meant, and it being part of the global populist moment in Scotland's happens in 2014, I just really wanted to emphasize that for listeners that might not be familiar with what happened in 2014, because I have no idea what that looks like from outside of Scotland, because every single day I was either speaking at a meeting probably in a working class community in a miners' welfare or small town hall, or a like hastily arranged rally, or I was giving out leaflets or chapping doors in tower blocks. Like the amount of activity that was going on and the amount of ordinary people who were engaged in that activity, like it wasn't a like professional leftist astroturf campaign.
Yeah.
It was very grassroots. And the thing that always sticks with me about it, and what I think is very similar to some of the instincts around Brexit, is that people felt for the first time in their lives that their vote was actually going to count. Because people in, like, do you know what I mean, Glasgow, voting Labour for 100 years and nothing changes, right? You still have some of the worst areas of deprivation. You still have some of the lowest life expectancies. You still have some of the highest unemployment rates. People have been voting Labour. The vote doesn't count. Get a Tory government. Vote for the SNP ones. Doesn't matter. Get a Tory government. Scotland's votes generally don't really change the colour of government. People at that point as well, when the referendum starts to be discussed, we're looking at Westminster. Right? And remember, this is pre-Corbyn. And I always think, to me, like, so much politics has happened in such a short period of time. So much has happened. It's pre-Corbyn. So we're looking at Tories who are, you know, ramping up austerity. You've got the Labour Party and people like Rachel Reeves saying we'll be tougher on welfare than the Tories and all that. Everyone's committed to Trident. Everyone wants like more nuclear weapons, the bigger the better. So people are sick of meaningless choices, genuinely sick of it, right? So you have really low voter turnouts and engagement and all of that stuff. And what happened was that I remember at one point feeling like the rest of the UK, I mean, I say that, I mean, particularly the sort of like London kind of liberal types are kind of like looking and laughing at us. Everybody thinks this is a joke. So did the Prime Minister. Thought it was a joke. Thought it was a wee jokey vote. No one's really going to turn up. It's going to be like that AV vote. No one's really going to give a shit. And they ignored it and ignored it and ignored it until the last 3 months, where they had completely shat themselves. They had. And then there was suddenly this panic from the establishment. In the last 3 months of the Scottish independence referendum campaign, every headline, every news programme, every think tank, Barack Obama, the Queen, the European Union, they're all coming out saying, if you vote for this, you'll lose your job, your home, your pension, you'll be eaten out of bins, I don't know, whatever fear story they could come up with. And it was just constant Project Fear. And people voted for it anyway. People voted for independence. So 45% still voting. Like, regardless of all of that scaremongering, like, there was a real sense of people expressing their agency. And that was the really powerful thing about it. I think there are some parallels there with Brexit.
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
I think it's an expression of agency. And I think all the fear mongering, so I saw it, like all my interactions with the EU referendum were all looking at what was happening in the English press. There wasn't a campaign up here.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, this all sounds very familiar.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny hearing you say that, Kat.
Like it sounds like that.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing as Phil, really. It actually sounds like hearing Phil and George talk about Brexit and the EU. If you just remove the terms, I'd be like, yeah, well, it's about Brexit rather than Scottish independence. I did want to ask something, and maybe to play slightly devil's advocate, but and also to a certain extent go against what David said, a point which I generally agree with about looking at politics from where you are and fighting for democracy rather than from some abstract point of view and some abstract recipe about what socialism is, and that means not being nationalist or something like that. But obviously, you already mentioned Catalonia. Wales should maybe be brought in, the Basque Country, and various other national independence movements. What is your position on that? I mean, how does that flow from your support for Scottish independence? Because I mean, I guess to put it in a more critical way, I would be concerned about about fragmentation, if not quite balkanization, then the kind of breakup of multinational states. And I think multinational states are good insofar as it's operates on a universalist principle that people of different types can live together and form a common polity based on a civic identity rather than any kind of more essentialist one. And especially with the kind of growth of essentialism, whether you see it in terms of identity politics or whatever, isn't there a risk with kind of national independence movement of breaking apart kind of, a Spanish entity or a UK entity or something like that?
I mean, I think that's a good point. I think that's a valid worry. I don't think you can just have a universal position on the national question. I don't think that can be achieved, basically. I think you have to take each national case on its merit. So there are some national questions that are completely obvious, like Palestine, because it's a site of, national oppression. There are, and that was traditionally the kind of nationalist movements in the colonized world and so on. It's quite an obvious orientation that you would have on that from a socialist standpoint. But there are many European national questions that are much more complicated. So, for example, in Belgium, there are national questions where the divisions sometimes are fueled by reactionary politics or ethnic politics or whatever. I mean, I don't have a particularly strong analysis of South Tyrol, for example. There are as many national questions in Europe as there are countries, which incidentally is one of the reasons why it was always strange that people thought that the European Union would support the breakup of some of Europe's most powerful nation states. You get this idea that the European Union would somehow be a friend of the Catalan movement or Scottish independence or whatever. There's an obvious reason why they will never support that, which is that it threatens to set off bombs all over the continent in terms of every powerful nation has its own internal national question. So no, I don't think you can abstractly extrapolate a whole theory for all these different sort of national movements. If there is a unifying position, though, it's defence for national self-determination. So in the case of Catalonia, for example, what must be totally obvious is that an authoritarian state cracking down on democratic rights, often in a very violent way, arresting people for nonsense and all this kind of thing, which is more generally part of the condition of the Spanish state. It's not just about Catalonia. That obviously can be opposed on a much more, kind of uniform basis. But yeah, I don't necessarily think that a national independence movement is always the solution. And always, I don't know how I would have felt about Scottish independence at the time of, say, the 1926 general strike, where you had a unified Britain-wide working class movement organised through steel and coal and the railways, and they were all fighting together and so on. At some level, support for national independence has to be contingent on a wider body of factors. And you do, of course, more so in the third world, get a situation where sometimes, the kind of the metropolitan centres of the system deliberately conspire to sow national divisions in order to exploit resources and so on. So yeah, I don't think that you can simply establish a worldwide position that every small nation, should become independent.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I would also say, I think that the example of Scottish independence, not uniquely itself by nature of being Scottish independence, but only Scotland can sort of pull the starting gun on this, and that's the breakup of the British state. I think that Scotland pulling the starting gun on independence actually is probably one of the only options for true democratization of what is the British state. I still see the United Kingdom as part of the project, a project of American imperialism in Europe. Solidified and championed in the Blair years. I don't see any the questions of NATO membership, of Trident, these big things, the parts of the British state that you can't vote away, the lobbying, the House of Lords, all of that. I think that Scottish independence and that rupture provides a starting point for actual processes of democratization of the British state.
Sorry, go on, Philip.
No, you go on, David, go on.
I almost wanted to ask Philip or George in particular, perhaps, because you are in the English national context. I don't know a lot about this question, but it seems to me that, I think that England is one, the national unit within the UK. Well, not necessarily the UK, because Northern Ireland is obviously a totally different kettle of fish. But within Britain, Scotland, Wales, and England, I mean, in Scotland and in Wales, for example, national traditions and institutions have been preserved as part of the UK Constitution. There's no real mirror of that in England. I mean, I think the English national question is quite extreme, and in terms of the lack of representation within England, the problems of regionalisation in England, which are extremely acute. I mean, Scotland is actually one of the wealthier parts of the UK. Obviously, parts of like the Midlands and the Northeast and so on in England are grossly underserved, democratically, economically, all the rest of it. And my assumption was, and this is perhaps why Brexit didn't have quite the same even interest in Scotland, is that Brexit was partly an attempt to answer the English question on behalf of masses of English people. So I'm kind of interested in that angle as well. Like I would hope that the Scottish national question could be part of answering the English national question. So that's just what I'm going to take on that.
It's a really good point, and I certainly wouldn't. I don't know about George. I certainly wouldn't disagree with you about the, how important that kind of motor of English provincial and rural revolt against the southeast, the metropolitan southeast, was as part of, and the old Labour heartlands as part of the Brexit process. I suppose we can talk a bit more about it when we get to talk about kind of what a federal Britain might look like. But I wanted to push you both a little bit on this question. So Kat has made a very powerful case for Scottish independence, and you have as well, David, with respect to how Scottish independence kind of sets alight kind of the question of the English national question. And Kat made the case for Scottish independence as setting the firing gun on the breakup of this kind of decrepit imperial structure that is the kind of the current UK. I suppose my question to you guys is, though, we've just been talking about how much of this politics is driven as a revolt against Westminster. How can you be confident that the Scottish independence isn't a product of the void rather than a solution? So you've made the case about how, it would kind of, it's a democratization and it is a way of renewing popular self-government in Scotland, particularly among all those voters and people who've been alienated from the central state in Westminster. But what if you're just as trapped in the void as the current kind of political structures and at Scottish independence? How can you be confident Scottish independence is an escape from it?
You see, I think it's definitely both. It's definitely both a product and a response. I mean, again, my feeling again with the Scottish independence question is, from the outside looking in, you only see the extreme technocracy. You only see the anti-politics of Nicola Sturgeon, who's this extreme example of like an anti-politics figurehead. People just project onto her what they want, which is how she can garner mass support from working class populists and PMC liberal bedwetters, and they're all projecting onto her precisely what they want from politics rather than what they're getting. So clearly that there are dangers in that scenario. But that to me is what the rebirth. I hope that with Brexit and Scottish independence and all these, and the yellow vests in France and all these other movements, we're seeing the rebirth of a democratic popular instinct in politics. And the birth agony of that will be highly contradictory and painful. And one of the things that it will produce is forces of this kind. I mean, in a sense, every anti-political figurehead has been the same. Trump was the same. Trump talked a great game about, reindustrialization and make America great again. And he's going to make American heartlands. He's going to give America back to them and all this kind of stuff. Of course, in reality, he was a hollow man. Yeah. And that's what you have with the SNP as well. But I'm still confident that you can act on those contradictions and work on those contradictions to try and draw out the popular democratic attitudes. I mean, to make one point that I think needs to be made, because again, this might be totally invisible from outside of Scotland. Scotland, until the lockdown, had its largest social movement in its entire history. There were, every other week, there was a mass demonstration in a Scottish town or city, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, up to 100,000 people on pro-independence marches. Nicola Sturgeon never set foot on one of those marches. She did get on a plane to London to march on the People's Vote March and take a stupid looking selfie with what's his name, Tony Blair's Alistair Campbell, his famous picture of Sturgeon with Alistair Campbell grinning like a moron. That tells you everything. The SNP hate on a level the independence movement that's put them in power. And it's totally evident, which is the backdrop to how you can have this totally hegemonic party that wins every single election, but internally, it's an absolute bin fire. It's constantly on fire. There's constant conflicts between different factions in the party because it draws together these two different impulses in a deeply, deeply contradictory way. That means that it's going to, like I say, the case for independence is now so contradictory that independence isn't going to happen under this platform. It's too contradictory to work.
Yeah, it's that part. It's the sort of group of people I described as the kind of anti-establishment dissidents who are on those marches. Like they're huge. It's much bigger than anything like the anti-war movement, and we had huge demonstrations here. And I mean, not only has Nicola Sturgeon not been near them, I don't even think she mentioned them on her social media, because Sturgeon has ultimately used the popular base of working class support for the SNP to pursue support among the class least likely to support independence, namely the PMC. Her politics is absolute centrist liberalism, and her offer to Scotland is really to preserve that status quo against Westminster. She openly proclaims herself, of course, as a fangirl for people like Hillary Clinton, and she's promoted layers of these young Turks who increasingly epitomise the bland HR-friendly PMC outlook of all Scotland's professional politicians. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant.
No, but I mean, wonderful, and I mean, it's very interesting to hear you guys tell us from what it looks like on the inside, and making clear that Nicola Sturgeon sees Hillary Clinton as a role model and has this kind of HR vision of the kinds of people that she promotes is wonderfully clarifying.
I think she plays this really interesting dual role because she presents to the middle class as a figure of continuity, and she presents to the working class as a figure of rupture on the pro-independence part. So she's very good at playing this game of competency. The SNP since 2016 have barely made a single policy achievement during all that time. And to explain it away, they say, it's Westminster's fault. And then they say, independence, it'll eventually happen. And when it happens, we'll make big changes then. But that's why Sturgeon succeeds where other kind of Clintonite centrist types fail, is that she's able to present to the middle class as this continuity, stable, house prices type figure. And for the working class, once we get independence, we'll do all those things that need to be done.
Yeah.
So I guess there's
there's
an analog here, obviously, one of many with Brexit around accountability, and this obviously being one of the strongest arguments for Brexit, being that it removes that kind of the external constraints that domestic politicians choose to put on themselves and limit their kind of scope for action, which of course is just them wanting to evade democratic accountability at home. But I think one thing which came out of, I think, particularly some of the points that you were making, David, was what's the strongest argument against Scottish independence from this point of view? Because I think you both touched a little bit on how there's a kind of a nationalist movement which is at least partly hostile to national sovereignty, wants to hand power out everywhere other than keeping it in Scotland. I mean, is this a contingent factor, or is this the kind of the challenge that independents or socialists in favour of independence are facing?
I think to answer that lastly, I think it's a problem of political articulation. So there is a problem in that. Look, the mood of the yes vote in 2014 was very much take back control. It wasn't. people on this listening to this podcast will know that there are, two souls of leftist politics. There's a tradition that sees popular democracy, mass self-activity on the part of the population as the route to social change. And there's a tradition of left-wing politics very dominant today, which is kind of Fabian, about kind of social engineering. It's faintly elitist. I think it's important to say that the version of left-wing politics that you would see in the housing schemes and so on in 2014 was much more about, they don't represent me, I want to say over my life. It's that classic stuff, the same stuff you saw reflected in a lot of the Leave vote. The problem is one of political articulation, where that general feeling is raised to a level of program, right? And we know that this is the general problem, because there's that mood there, but the program that it's supporting, at least at a Scottish election, is one which is extremely elitist, extremely technocratic, extremely about managing the population, indeed managing the democratic rights of the people who are voting fundamentally for democracy, they're voting fundamentally for control. So yes, there is a lag in where those aspirations meet with an actual practical political program that can fulfill them, and that is a serious problem. The greatest argument against Scottish independence is the SNP leadership, and in 2014, a lot of us spent a lot of time, and indeed it was quite a general argument on the independence movement. Back then, the SNP was a small party, only had about 25,000 members. We don't know how many members they have now, because so many have left in recent years that they don't publish the figures anymore over these internal fights. But there was a time when the party membership reached something like 120,000 people, so that it was a significant proportion of the Scottish population. But back then, people would say, don't make this a referendum on the SNP, because a lot of people don't like the SNP. And there are a lot of constituencies, including a lot of traditional working class constituencies, who traditionally don't like the SNP. For example, the Irish diaspora traditionally don't like the SNP because it was traditionally a Presbyterian party. The current SNP leadership is the best argument against independence. But
is that, sorry, just to interject there, because there's a kind of a similarity with those old Lexit arguments, which were essentially the same sort of form. That's like the idea is good, but the people in charge are no bueno, so we shouldn't do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, we came up against the same stuff with Nigel Farage all the time. When I said I was voting Leave in 26, people were like, oh, you're friends with Nigel Farage now and all this kind of stuff. I think you need to have the courage of your convictions. And what I said in 2016 was, I'm not fucking scared of Nigel Farage, right? If the left comes with it from a position of popular democracy and it fights on that basis, we actually can beat Nigel Farage. He's not Hitler. Like, stop all this stuff. He's just a Tory boy who fell out with the Tory party because he's Eurosceptic. He can be beat, right? Nicola Sturgeon can be beat. These people do not necessarily write the destiny of the future of the country, not least because, and I think this is important to say because there's an election in Scotland in a couple of months' time, there's not going to be an independence referendum in the short run. It's not an immediate prospect. And it's not an immediate prospect because of the utter mess that the SNP leadership has made of the prospectus. There's simply no way to progress towards independence when you have mutually exclusive headline economic proposals for the independent country. So those contradictions will become extremely tense in the next few years. And it's a question of organising the agency as best you can to break through with those contradictions on the side of the popular democratic argument.
So it'd be interesting. I want to talk a bit more about the contradictions of the economic program and what a kind of a viable independent Scotland looks like economically, given, like you say, the complete mess of the SNP vision for it. But before that, I suppose, so if you cast it in terms of taking back control, I suppose this is my worry about Scottish independence, is that it will make the project of taking control more difficult, which is to say enhancing self-rule and democratic power on this island together. Because it risks dividing the English and the Scottish nations. And it seems to me, if democratic power is enhanced by having more people engaged collectively in the project of self-rule, dividing up that collectivity making the relations between Scotland and England relations between, international relations, it risks diluting that potential. And so, as well as potentially risking future conflict and strife, and as some of that ugliness already came down in lockdown over English diseased kind of COVID carriers going up to Scotland and all of that. So I suppose the question is, does that prospect of political fragmentation not cut against the socialist case for fraternity and cooperation?
I mean, this just like, I mean, I'm not following the argument properly, but this sounds like an argument for unity of the British working class. It is, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the problem is
would that be easier if we're not separate countries?
Why? Because, so from my understanding, right, we are the period of neoliberalism has systematically destroyed the institutions of the British working class. So we don't have the big British working class institutions that can operate as a bloc like that. Look at things like the Labour Party or the trade union movement. They don't exist. They exist in a version of nostalgia that has been destroyed by neoliberalism, right? So we are where we are. Part of one of the consequences of that has been this break in Scottish consciousness, where people are fed up of voting for the same parties. They see their agency as lying within being able to vote for independence. That's a part of it. So I don't see why the working class needs to be unified in a British sense. I don't have any problems with solidarity across borders. I don't feel differently about people in the north of Ireland than I do in the south of Ireland in terms of the working class, just because one's part of the UK and some are in the south. So I do think that there's a danger in engaging in a kind of nostalgia trip about the unity of the British working class when we live in a country where solidarity is essentially illegal. You can barely take strike action unless you do all these things. And I don't really see a plan to get out of that. And it can't be around Brexit in Scotland. It's just not the moment. And it's not the moment of consciousness. And it's not the moment of democratic revolt.
So, I mean, I take all of those points. I suppose my worry is that Scottish independence risks reinforcing that. And I suppose you could say, well, it's a risk, and it's a risk we're willing to take. But I suppose I see the risk as higher, that it would be normalizing and reinforcing that process of the disintegration, political disintegration, rather than reestablishing the basis for a revival of popular democratic and working class politics.
I mean, I think. Sorry, you go, George. No, it's okay.
No, I think that's the sort of major point about whether the drive toward whether the kind of the breaking up and the fragmentation leads to decreasing possibility for taking control of the democratic institutions that currently exist, and whether independence in that context is essentially, I think, as you were saying, Kat, is kind of a response to and a kind of deepening of or continuation of some of these processes of creating the void. But David, I see you've got your very politely your hand up to come in.
I think this a really important point to make in this, which is, I mean, what Philip just alluded to, I mean, it was actually quite a tiny and comical thing of people protesting on the border, English people driving, but it was also the Scottish government supported this, thing under the lockdown conditions. But to me, the fragmentation, the national fragmentation of Britain is accelerated by the union. I mean, that's the basis on. You have a situation where Nicola Sturgeon knows there's not going to be an independence referendum, but she's constantly dangling it like a carrot. But so is Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson constantly says there's going to be an independence referendum, and he knows there isn't. Scottish unionists in Scotland say they talk about nothing but Scottish independence. There is no other policy that they are going to have in the forthcoming election. So they only have, and under the impact partly of the Scottish independence question, the Tory party has, of course, become much more concentrated in England. It's not a Britain-wide party anymore. So that fragmentation is already underway, and in a sense, it's accelerated by the continuation of the union. Secondly, it's continuated by devolution. And devolution has been a very double-edged sword, to say the least. in Scotland, what devolution, you saw this around the current inquiry, the Scottish Parliament inquiry. Scotland's institutions have been, many of them, hideously weakened by the process of devolution. Middle-class professionals have fallen on the institutions of devolution like locusts and ravished them. So people sometimes refer to them as devocrats. You have this kind of bureaucratic, technocratic layer who have emerged in Scotland, who are highly managerial. They're constantly pushing for alliances of trade unions and business owners and this kind of corporatism thing and so on. And my worry about federalism is that it would just be this process on steroids. It would become an instrument to further degrade democratic institutions.
So you mentioned, David, this your concern with federalism as a solution to the problems of British politics, and because you say this group of devocrats who've ravished the institutions of Scottish public life, that in a federal system that would be exacerbated. And just to put this into context for our listeners, so there's a lot of talk at the moment within particularly among the national parties, Labour and the Tories, of some kind of new federalised British Union. And there's different models being proposed, and some of these include a Parliament for England. Currently, there isn't. There is just the Union Parliament in London, which is at the same time the English Parliament. And so one of the other models is some people suggest an English Parliament as well as then a federal Parliament for the nations, and that each nation would have greater autonomy in terms of revenue-raising powers and the like, and it would only be defence and foreign policy that would be concentrated at the federal level. Now, I mean, the details of all of these specific projects aside, would you guys be open in principle to a federal Britain? Is there some version of a federation that could potentially meet your socialist aspirations, which is to say perhaps not immediately, but, as a longer path, as well as perhaps meeting your concerns for greater national autonomy?
I mean, I doubt it, to be honest. I mean, hypothetically anything's possible, but what I see from demands for federalism. I mean, first of all, in Scotland, it doesn't exist as a question. The Scottish Labour Party, which is a rump party now, and as far as I can tell, it's decisive. The Scottish Labour Party will probably never return to the role that it once played in Scotland. They're the only people who talk about this federal option, and they do it in much the same way as a Trotskyist sect would. Like they've come up with this abstract program, a transitional program, and everyone else should agree with it. And they get very angry at people who don't agree with it. But it has no wider discussion in society. It's purely a product of Scottish Labour's bid on the national issue because they're frightened of either unionism or independence in a straightforward way. And my concern, as I said, is what kind of structures and what sort of social class elements administer these federal structures. The late Neil Davidson, who, if any of your listeners, really want to read anyone on Scotland, you could do a lot worse than Neil Davidson, who's a sort of Marxist who wrote an excellent book called Discovering the Scottish Revolution. Another one, The Origins of Scottish Nationhood. These are really good kind of textbooks for understanding Scottish history. But he said that the danger always was devolving the axe, that basically you have this long hierarchical structure of devolutionary processes. No one is fundamentally accountable. Everyone blames everyone else, and you have different little pockets of the managerial elite implementing cuts and removing democratic rights and all this kind of stuff. And all of them are just blaming each other, which is what's happening, of course, with devolution. The SNP get away with a huge amount, simply on the basis that they are not Westminster and they are not in full control of what goes on in the country. And of course, you get this in countries relating to the EU as well. The SNP never cease to say that we can't bail out this or that industry because of the EU. And they did it right up to the day when we formally left. But of course, they're still doing it because they want back in the EU. They still have this pressure of not using state aids that we now have we have more levers, more influence over because of Brexit and so on. They won't use it because they are deferential to other layers of management and administration. And my fear would be that a federal Britain would become another of those structures.
So actually on that sort of question, because we haven't really talked about the economics of it, I guess, which is that, I always was struck by the notion that when people talk about Scottish independence, but assume that it would remain within the EU or that Scotland would retain the sterling as a currency, it sounded to me like a pretty empty sort of independence that you'd be having if you can't set your own monetary policy and so on. But there's other issues at stake as well. I mean, so, unionists will argue that Britain subsidizes Scotland with social spending, which is actually a thing that happens, I guess, in many other different areas where, you have it sort of with Flanders and Belgium as well. And then on the other hand, you have, I guess, Scottish nationalists will make the point that if North Sea oil is actually factored in and that there's a boom in renewable energy, then Scotland is viable on its own. Where do you stand on this? I mean, and what is kind of what would the makeup of Scotland's economy be in an independent state?
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of strange conversation to have, because these days and for the last couple of years, you've had to fight so many battles over just saying things like we should have our own currency that other economic questions are rarely come into it. I think, because you got the same thing over Brexit, right? You got, we get so much money chucked at us from the European Union. How will we survive outside of this trading regime and all this kind of stuff? The general point I would make, and I think everyone who's serious on the radical left needs to stick by it, is democracy is the fundamental question. If you can democratize society, then you can create, a popular basis for a successful society. This isn't to say that there aren't serious problems, right? So, for example, obviously, we are trying to make an argument about Scottish independence and sovereignty, but we don't believe in sort of Juche in Northern Europe. Scotland will still be conditioned.
All right, that is going to be the title of the show.
So and it still has political and social and economic consequences that Scotland will still be connected to its largest trading partner in our UK. All of us have to struggle with the reality that we want democracy in a globalized world, and that there are contradictions there that we have to somehow meet. But think of it like this: throughout this crisis, the most astonishing thing has happened, which is at the height of it, the UK government put 10 million workers on furlough. Whatever criticisms people have of that furlough scheme and so on, a country that doesn't have its own central bank can't do that. This is the kind of stuff that is just not going on in the heads of supporters of the mainstream case, the leadership case, as it were, for Scottish independence. You'd have to knock on doors and say, remember that furlough scheme? We couldn't do that. If you lack economic sovereignty on that basis, in the economic period that we're in and probably continuing to move into, you've got nothing. And all these arguments about kind of, how you're going to make up for the lost trade and all that kind of stuff, they just don't compare to having the basic governmental and democratic structures that any, independent state would require. And there are other problems. So, for example, and this is connected to the crisis, for example, of the Scottish media and the fact that the Scottish government's had to bail them out. Scotland suffers from a problem of acute foreign ownership in its economy. So American influence is very strong in the Scottish economy, and that to me should also be addressed. That's also part of the independence debate.
Yeah.
You can't have an economy completely dominated by foreign corporations. And once again, that means taking questions like a central bank, like state aid and so on seriously, which the SNP leadership routinely refused to do.
Yeah. So recently, there's been plenty of factional fighting in the ruling Scottish National Party between its current leader and Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and its former leader, Alex Salmond. Now, the details of the story are pretty involved and complex, and they've only recently broken onto the wider British national press. So this is a difficult thing because I've not read anything which summarizes this effectively. So I'm going to give you guys the very challenging, the challenge of if you can summarize what's happened, but also explain what's at stake beneath the kind of, the ins and outs and details of it.
Okay, I'll absolutely try my best. I did think about this before I came on, because as you say, it's near impossible to get like a good summary of what's actually been happening in this giant car crash, very slow moving car crash. So as you said, it's there's a split emerged, a very nasty and vicious split between Alex Salmond, who's probably one of the most significant figures in Scottish political history, or recent Scottish political history, rather. He's also the former mentor of Nicola Sturgeon, the current First Minister, as you said. And what has happened is that there has been a series of court battles between Alex Salmond and the Scottish government. First of all, Alex Salmond suing them over a particular process and culminating in a criminal trial. And the basis of that trial was Alex Salmond was accused of 14 charges of sexual assault. He was accused of sexual harassment in the workplace, which he had taken the government to court over a botched process. And in that criminal trial, which was kind of the nadir of the whole thing, he was acquitted on all charges, and the Scottish government is then instructed to make a payout, basically because of the botched process and yada yada. So what's then happened is there's been an investigation committee set up. And I don't know if you've had the joy of watching any of our wonderful investigation committee. No, you haven't. So there's been a really painful, drawn out committee investigating this whole affair, well, particularly the way that the complaints of sexual harassment against Alex Salmond were handled. So Nicola Sturgeon has had to give evidence. Alex Salmond's given evidence. Nicola Sturgeon's husband, who's the chief executive of the SNP, has also given evidence, and the permanent secretary has given evidence. And there's so much coming out of it about evidence that's been hidden. Alex Salmond is claiming conspiracy. Nicola Sturgeon is very much using, I would say, like aspects of Me Too and things like that to make her case. I think she's an incredibly skilled politician, because half the journalists in Scotland were duped by the fact that she's genuinely empathetic. Which, I mean, that's big alarm bells for me. But why this matters, right, I think, is because the SNP have presented themselves and the Scottish Parliament and Scottish institutions as truly better, as superior to them down there in Westminster. And what's happening is that is very quickly unraveling, and it's starting to show in the polls for May's election. So I remember the last leaflet that went out in 2014 from the official SNP Yes Scotland campaign for independence. And on it, it had Big Ben snapping in two. It did look like it was from the Socialist Workers' Party. Big Ben snapping in two, and it said, they lied about weapons of mass destruction. They lied about expenses. They lied about Scotland's oil. What else are they lying about? So there was this whole thing about like Westminster's full of cheats and liars. It's corrupt. It's rotten to the core. That's why we need independence, because Scottish institutions they're pure and superior and really democratic. And actually, this process is taking a really black and white moral assertion about Scotland and showing that there's much more of a grey area. And I think that, there's one particular reason that some people might think that independence, as a movement is potentially threatened by this whole thing.
So just to follow up on that a little bit, do the two protagonists represent, so Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, represent different political factions within the SNP or wider Scottish society, or is it just a bit of kind of sub House of Cards political intrigue?
I suppose, Salmond and Sturgeon represent basically the same leading faction of the SNP, but underneath that, some of the kind of populist element has latched on to Salmond's case. So every single issue in the SNP becomes an item of shadow boxing. So whether it's the Salmond and Sturgeon split, or the GRA reform, or the hate crime bill, which has just passed, all these sorts of issues are latched onto by various actors who want a fight over a much more general but vague feeling that we're not moving towards independence. And there's impatience in parts of the movement about that situation. So no, I mean, they have very similar politics. There are one or two interesting differences between them, but basically, Salmond laid down all the markers that Sturgeon has followed. If anything, Sturgeon's a bit more technocratic and robotic, but apart from that, there's not a serious programmatic difference between them.
At least she's not being called a sex pest by her own lawyer.
So how far, David, is it legitimate to characterise Scotland as a one-party state? And would it be fair to say its institutions and public life have been captured by the SNP? I mean, this claim is heard frequently or with increasing frequency now south of the border. It's also been very powerfully made by Andrew Neil, who we've already mentioned, the Scottish journalist and also editor of the conservative magazine, The Spectator.
Yeah, I mean, a one-party state, obviously, a pedant would very quickly just say a one-party state is a state in which only one party is allowed. It's not really the SNP. You can blame many things on the SNP, but not the utter shitness of the opposition parties, which are truly terrible. In fact, the greatest sense in which Scotland is a one-party state is just that it's a sort of liberal one-party state, in that you have 5 parties in the Scottish Parliament, and they all are basically socially and economically liberal, with the odd bit here or there, difference. All the press share a very common liberal consensus. So it's easy to see how the constitutional question has become such a divisive issue in Scottish politics because of the just unanimity of everything else. But there is a serious problem in the institutional life of the Scottish state, or rather the Scottish society. Scottish state is part of the British state. So you have a situation where the SNP, having been in power for 14 years and no one can lay a glove on them, has been corrosive in that the Scottish government is, even by the standards of Western kind of liberal democracies and the decline that they've all experienced in the last 30 or 40 years, incredibly opaque, over-centralised. As Kat said, the leader of the party, the governing party, is the husband of the leader of the government, for example. The inner circle of the government and the SNP, it's 3 or 4 people. And everyone else is, kept in the dark on major issues. The SNP as a party itself has little to no internal democracy. When policies are passed at local branches and submitted to the conference, there's a committee that just throws them out if they're considered too controversial. So that has bred out in concentric circles into various other institutions. The Scottish government, and this is how devolution works, runs a kind of patronage model. A lot of things are obviously dependent on the funds that Scotland gets from the British state. Then those are handed out to friends, basically. So you've created a perfect breeding ground for, a very narrow and limited democratic sphere. I mean, this situation is now so extreme because, for example, all the major Scottish newspapers are funded by the state because they don't function anymore on a commercial basis. So you have a situation where, during Nicola Sturgeon's evidence to the inquiry, the Scottish government, the Justice Minister, was live tweeting the entire thing. And then you had Scottish journalists tweeting about how great Nicola Sturgeon is. And these are supposed to be, this is like the unionist press. This is the other thing. The unionist establishment in Scotland, parts of it, they love Nicola Sturgeon. Which tells you a thing or two about who this was, and hate her opponents. So, for example, just to return to how savage the internal factional struggles in the independence movement are, the leadership of the SNP, the leading faction, frequently accuses the movement of being under the influence of Russia. This is a constant thing. So, for example, the SNP played an important role in the Westminster Committee that accused Brexit of being a Trojan horse for Russian influence. And during that report, and it's not just Brexit, Scottish independence is also a Trojan horse for Russian influence. And of course, these journalists just gobble up these lines. They hate the independence movement, constantly accuse them of being assets for Russia, or as I saw today, Iran. I don't know what the Khomeinites have in play in Scotland, but so Russia,
George Galloway.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's an extremely peculiar situation. in Scottish society, where there are very few moving parts of the Scottish middle class that are not in this kind of relationship with the central government. And I mean, some of the opaqueness in the government is utterly ridiculous. Famously, Nicola Sturgeon and her colleagues never write anything down. So, because there's have such a secretive culture in the party for so long. So, for example, there's no paper trail in Scotland as to how lockdown conditions were arrived at. There's no official written advice from the chief medical officer or anyone. It's insane.
Astonishing. What's the rationale for that? I heard Little Wayne doesn't write his lyrics down because he doesn't have time and he can remember them. But what's the rationale for them not writing anything down?
The journalists. I mean, they don't supply one. They just keep their mouth shut. So like there's no explanation as to why nothing's ever written down. So we have no paper trail that explains to us how we ended up in lockdown or how specific decisions were taken or any of this kind of stuff. There were just meetings between the First Minister and the Chief Medical Officer and a few other bureaucrats in which they discussed all this stuff but didn't write anything down. There's no submitted advice or anything like that. And that's a big problem because in the Scottish care homes, I mean, this is a much bigger scandal than anything else that's animating Scottish politics at this point, was atrocious, the death rate in Scottish care homes. But we have no idea what precautions were taken or not taken or whatever. So there's a fundamental problem with democracy when the government simply doesn't record its decision-making processes.
It's been fantastic, really wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, I've actually I enjoyed myself.
Thanks very much, and thanks for letting us contribute to this project, because I think this podcast is really important in exploring. I mean, what we've been discussing is, in some sense, is very similar questions, just in different national contexts that this podcast has explored, over so many episodes. So, yeah, it's exciting to bring, a little bit of that analysis into that picture.
That's great, and we'll have to have you guys back on to check in when things kind of really heat up. So, all right, that's it from us for today. Catch you later. Bye bye.
Sorry, I kind of butted in.
No, it's all right.
It's shite being Scottish. We're the lowest of the low, the scum of the fucking earth, the most wretched, miserable, servile, pathetic trash that was ever shot into civilization. Some people hate the English, I don't. They're just wankers. We, on the other hand, are colonised by wankers. Can't even find a decent culture to be colonised by. We're ruled by effete arseholes.